Thank you. Can you hear me, by the way? Yeah, seems to work. All right. Well, thanks everyone for making it after lunch. What? Okay. Is audio working? Okay. Very nice. So yeah. So I'm Tobias. I work on the GNOME design team, and this is Jordan. He's on the release team. And over the past few years, we've kind of like worked on every part of the GNOME stack, whether that's like third-party apps or core apps, core system stuff, and everywhere in between. And I think like this talk is maybe a little bit of like a high-level reflection of some of the things we've learned through the time, and maybe that the wider community has learned over the past few decades of trying to make this sort of free software, consumer software thing, sort of trying to get that to work. And the reason why we wanted to give this talk and how this whole thing kind of came about was we were at Guadec this year, and we were talking about this conference and how sort of there's a lot of assumptions in things like the Linux app ecosystem, because we kind of see ourselves as like, you know, there's like Windows and then there's the Mac, and we want to be like this third player, right? We're the other one, and like you build for this one too. And I think the piece that often we're missing, right? Like you think of, when you systems, you think of like, oh, we're gonna have all these apps, and like everyone's gonna build for our amazing platform, and you really sort of like think of this sort of superficial layer of the thing you want. But what often kind of gets left out is the reason why that works in some places and why maybe it doesn't as well in our area. And that's the layer below that, which is the platform. And I think we kind of throw that word around a lot, just like sort of not defining it super well. And I think that might be part of the reason for some of the misunderstandings and issues that we've been having. So maybe a good starting point is like looking at a more detailed definition of that, and sort of maybe what some other platforms are doing, right? Just seeing like what does it take to sort of have a fully functional platform, and what are all the various pieces that you need for that. And there are a few audiences that you kind of need to make happy for that. There's the developers that obviously make the apps. There's the designers who design them, which is a part that we're often missing, I feel like, in free software, and is a very important part if you actually want like a very desirable set of like good third-party apps. And then there's of course the end users. On the developer side, it's like relatively straightforward what you need, right? Developers need an operating system to develop on that needs to be integrated with the actual technology, and like you need good developer tooling that runs on that, and that's like well integrated with the documentation, and you need sort of examples and guides and all of that to sort of help people get started. And then you need an app store kind of submission story, like, right, you made your app. Now how do you get it to people, right? Like submission, review, all of that stuff, like an actual app store. And then for designers, the requirements are kind of similar, but there's some extra stuff there. The OS doesn't matter as much as probably the tooling, because for designers to actually like make stuff on that platform, you really need good tooling for them so they can like make mockups and prototypes and sort of get to a point where before implementation starts, they've already thought through all the important things. You need a visual language and like design patterns, right? Is your platform like all wood and I don't know, like textures and metal, or is it super simple typography and like plain colors? I mean, these are like the extreme examples, but that kind of thing, right? Like developers and designers need to sort of be clear on what they're actually building for. And then there's like patterns such as navigation, and like how do you do menus and all these things, like and you need guidelines that define all of that and that sort of give the designers a good idea for what's needed there. And then on the end user side, similarly, you need an OS, which doesn't necessarily need to be the same as the OS that the developers are using, right? Like mobile does fine with two separate OSs, but I guess ideally it would be the same just because it's simpler. You need an app store, obviously, that people can download the apps that developers made from. And you need a support story of some kind. Ideally, you would have stores that people can go to get help, but probably that's not feasible in most cases. It would already be something, though, to have like a good Stack Overflow page or some kind of like story there for user support. And all of these different things, that's a lot of stuff, right? Make up a platform. And when we throw the word around, we often mean like one or two somewhere in this whole chart, but like you really need all of it for it to actually work. And we can sort of maybe simplify all of those down into these 4 categories to keep track of it a little easier. There's like, you have got to have an operating system. You have to have the developer tooling SDK side of it. You need to have an actual sort of set of design guidelines and a platform from that point of view, like what does everything look like. And you need an app store story.
So this brings us to our environment, and how does it look in our free software communities? We have Linux, which everybody throws around us the buzzword. Oh, I built for Linux. But what is Linux really? It's just a kernel, nothing of this. Many people by Linux, they mean the Linux desktop, which is most of the time some free desktop compliant environment. But free desktop itself also isn't any of this. It's not an operating system. It's mostly a place where different desktop implementations can share common infrastructure and avoid duplication and have things work across environments. Then we can look at distros. Ubuntu is a good example here because they have an operating system, they have an app store. They did not have a developer SDK or a design language. They almost had that with Unity 8. They were almost a platform with their own set of features that it wouldn't entail, default apps, visual language, toolkit, but they switched to GNOME recently and dropped Unity 8, so they're kind of like not, yeah. We moved to GNOME. GNOME has a pretty good developer tooling and design language. It kind of has an app store with FlatHub. Rob talked about it a bit earlier, but it's still not an operating system. There are like multiple distributions of GNOME and everybody packages it differently in a different configuration. So who else is out there? We have Elementary, which somehow, curiously enough, ticks all the boxes. They have an operating system, it's based on Ubuntu, but they go the extra mile to have pretty good developer tooling, really nice design language, and their own app store. And this brings us to something like this, which is a really nice application ecosystem that people have started targeting Elementary as the main platform and write all kinds of new apps just for Elementary. But why are they only ones?
Right, and that's a good question, and I think to sort of like look for an answer, we need to go maybe all the way back, like the very beginning, the 90s, when free software was just sort of starting out, and you had all these different disconnected projects, kind of like one of them was making a panel, and the other one was making a clock, and the other one's making like, I don't know, a file manager, and they were all like these completely disconnected projects. And the distributions started initially as like this thing that takes all these disparate pieces and actually makes a product out of them, right? But as desktops developed, like this is GNOME 1 here, like over the GNOME 2 cycle, like design kind of entered the pictures, and people like started caring about consistency and like making sure the whole thing actually is integrated better. And then as they moved further in that direction, we eventually got to the point where people realized that the whole experience should kind of be designed as one piece. And with GNOME 3, we're actually like pretty close to that, right? Like we have a single shell now that actually sort of is well integrated instead of like 15 random pieces that don't quite fit. We have a set of core apps. We have all sorts of underlying technologies that enable all of these experiences. And we're now at the point where desktops are really sort of moving towards being platforms, right? Like we saw with GNOME before, like there's not that much missing on the chart. And we're now at the point that despite sort of not everything being in place, at least on the GNOME side, which is what I know, like we're actually getting to the point where we sort of have a nice developer platform in some ways. Like there's a lot of cool third-party apps kind of that have come up in the last few years. And we're really moving in that direction. But that operating system side is still missing. So at the end of the day, like we're still in that 90s kind of paradigm of like the distributions are the final sort of step on the way to like people getting the software. And that's a bit of a weird mismatch, right? Like you have the desktops making a thing that used to be a bunch of random components, but now it's essentially just like one component that is actually a product all on its own, that then goes through the distribution repositories in order to get to the users. And that was fine, like when it was a whole bunch of stuff being integrated, but now there's not really that much integration happening anymore because it's already happening at the desktop level, right? And that's kind of awkward. And there's all sorts of like weird frictions happening there because of that. And the other interesting thing about this is that it puts desktop developers in a similar situation that app developers have been in for a very long time. Because app developers have always made products, right? An app is like a self-contained thing that works all on its own. And app developers care about the whole thing. And now desktops and app developers are essentially in that same paradigm, right? And they have the same gripes, right? There's the release schedule, which both app and desktop developers hate because, like, you release version something of your app now, next week the week after that, like they release, and then it's going to be frozen until who knows when. And then any bug fixes you make, I don't know, for the next year or whenever the next version comes out, are not going to reach your users, which is not great. And the same goes for desktops. There's packaging issues where the reality is that in distributions, most of the packagers have like 50 different packages that they're taking care of, and they don't know the software as well as the actual developers. And so you get all sorts of weird misunderstandings and issues from that. There's overriding just straight up the upstream decision where like upstream changes something, and then some distribution is like, well, actually, we wanted it the old way, or we want it a different way, or we have this problem that we want solved. And obviously, like if you're a person making a product, you want that product to get to people, right? You don't want someone else making some random decision in between without talking to you. And then there's all the issues around theming, branding, where, I mean, just generally like the same issue as the one we had before, but like for visuals, where if you apply random CSS to every app, it's going to break stuff. And I think that just leads to sort of this general situation where if you're a distribution, there's kind of like, it's kind of a no-win situation, because the incentives for you are the person sort of like closest to the actual people using the software. So you're like, I see this problem, I want to solve it. So you solve it downstream, but then like you end up like endless, where they have 1 million downstream patches, and every 6 months they need to rebase the whole thing, and they're basically doing nothing but rebase their patches on the upstream as it changes, right? And that's horribly inefficient for everyone. And I think sort of the incentive as the person who has the contact with end users is always going to be that, but like the problem is that those decisions can no longer happen at the downstream level because the integration is already happening upstream. Right. And so these problems are not new, and I think people have thought about them for a long time, and we have some solutions for them now, right? We're now at the point with Flatpak and FlatHub and so on, where like you can start making an app in GNOME Builder, you can test the Flatpak on your machine, and you can distribute it to FlatHub tomorrow, and people are going to be able to download that app. And then if you update it next week, people are going to get the update. And that's something that we like never had before. So we are making progress in this, right? The problem is that it doesn't neatly solve all of the issues that we mentioned before, because that desktop distro thing is still there, and there's still a lot of stuff that kind of like touches these various pieces from the host system. So you can't completely ignore the host, because I guess for two sets of reasons. There's the technical side of it, which is that if your host has an old Flatpak version, and the app uses like a portal to get a location or something, and the Flatpak version doesn't support that, it's not going to work. If you're trying to get a calendar or something through Evolution Data Server, and the host doesn't have that same version of that same API, it's not going to work. Various things about display servers, drivers, and so on. Like basically every interaction, everything that is not in the Flatpak sandbox and like that you need to interact with the host with, can potentially break stuff. And so the app developer story is not solved like from that perspective. And then there's the UX side of that, where I mean, like, your app is not just like a rectangle that runs on people's screens, right? Like, there are various integration points from a user perspective where, like, there's notifications. We used to have, like, in the shell top bar, there used to be like an app menu, which we recently changed, which is now in the application window. So, like, if you have an older version of the system, your system apps are going to have the menu up there, and the new Flatpak apps are going to have it in the window, which is confusing. Obviously, the usual stuff around style sheets and theming. So Flatpak currently uses the system style sheet and icons in all the Flatpak apps. So if the developer tests with the default like system style sheet, and then you run the app on some distribution that doesn't use that, well, there's still the same potential for breakage. So we haven't actually completely solved these issues, even for app developers. But the other thing is that even though like we sort of can now ship apps directly, the left side of the thing we haven't actually solved, right? Like, desktop developers are still facing all the same problems. And those distro-desktop conflicts will need to be addressed in order to actually fix the whole problem. And I think, and those essentially come in three stripes. There are the structural ones, which is essentially come from the fact that, from the incentives and how they're set up around this whole ecosystem. And they're very hard to fix. There's fragmentation ones, which more or less come from there being multiple of everything. And then there's the configuration ones, which are slightly easier, but still contribute to the overall experience being not great sometimes. So the structural ones are the hard ones, because release schedules are really tough to align, right? GNOME releases every 6 months. Distros release anywhere between 6 months and like 3 years. Until sort of that's aligned somehow, or like we have some solution for that, that's going to be a huge issue, because you might run a super new app on a very old system or the other way around, and at every point there's like friction happening. There's system UX changes. That's the thing that we mentioned before with Endless, where like you have a problem downstream, you want to fix it by like, I don't know, making some change to your shell, but then now you have a bunch of downstream patches, and not only are you creating huge amounts of work for yourself in the future, you're also fragmenting everything for everyone, because now app developers have to think about like, well, on Endless the thing is here, and like on Ubuntu it's there, and on Fedora it's here, and like the complexity just keeps ballooning with everyone who does that. And then there's obviously theming, which, yeah, I mean, don't change API from under people. And like the latest Ubuntu LTS is maybe a good example, because like on the release schedule side, they like have, I don't know, GNOME 3.28, like some very old version. But like in the meantime, the design guidelines changed, so the app menu, which used to be like up there in the top left, is now in the window. So if you install even like the sort of, you install Flatpak on it and you install some new apps, it's going to be somewhere else. UX changes stuff, like sort of solving problems downstream. I guess that, like, I don't know, they needed to somehow like make people from Unity sort of like feel at home. So they're like, okay, what can we do? Maybe we like add a dock to the left or something. And that's a very understandable thought process, right? But the problem is that the end result is never going to be good, because like if you make these fundamental UX changes to a system, you need to actually go all the way through. Because like what we're ended up now is like there's a weird app button at the bottom, and there's the activities at the top. And then you have this permanent dock, but also you have the overview, which really doesn't mesh. And the end result is not only like fragmentation for everyone, but also like a subpar experience, because these things have not been designed together, right? These decisions kind of can't be taken downstream. And then there's theming, which, yeah, like, I mean, there's like a button there to create a new folder that's invisible, which is not great. Oh yeah, and there's an extra column in the side of the, I don't know. And then we have fragmentation issues, which are basically the issues that arise from us having like multiple versions of everything. So, for example, there is no GNOME installer, and every distro rolls their own, because it's really hard to abstract across like what all the various distros do. We have lots of different package formats, which we have tried to abstract across, but that has caused lots of issues, which is why GNOME software is kind of like a little bit flaky sometimes. because it's really hard to keep all of that working sort of across various different abstractions. And the great example there is, as usual, the Fedora installer, which famously confusing. Configuration issues are a little bit less of a problem from an app developer perspective, but they kind of are a problem from a UX perspective just overall, because there are various settings that happen at the distribution level, but really are part of the whole experience. So like, the default apps that you ship should actually fit in with the whole system, right? And the way, I don't know, like the interfaces for like unlocking the disk encryption thing when you boot up should probably be designed at the same time as the rest of the system. But because things are configured downstream, this kind of doesn't work. And the great example there is this, which are these random strings when you want to unlock your disk, which really doesn't feel like part of the experience.
So where does it live our ecosystem currently? If we want healthy app ecosystems, which is, I guess, why we are all here in the Linux Application Summit, we need real platforms. And if we need real platforms, we need to address the conflicts that exist currently between the desktop developers and the distributors. Instead of developers having to target different metrics of distributions, they are currently targeting desktop platforms, essentially. And it already works that way, but when they ship their application, they have to account for all the different configurations of a desktop platform that might exist in across various distributions. So, how we could like address that is we could like take a look at the Flatpak example, how it works currently. Flatpak was designed from the start with two runtimes, the GNOME runtime and the KDE runtime. There were no distribution runtimes because the distributions are not the platforms, and they are not what the developers targeting. The desktop developers have complete control over the runtimes. They are built from scratch, not dependent on anything. And essentially, we could do something like this, which would be like the desktop developers shipping their software directly to end users and bypassing the distributions, essentially, like the app developers do currently. But this is not likely in the short term because it requires a lot of amount of work and resources that no project currently has and or will have in the near future, most likely. So we'll end up with something like this. So this is almost the current thing, but the main point here is how the desktop developers and distributions need to start working closer together and be more engaged across their issues and coordinate more about all of their decisions. If you make a change as downstream distribution to address a certain issue, bring that upstream. Like, what problem are you trying to solve? Why is it like that? What studies have you done? And if it's a good change, let's upstream it, and so everybody can from it. So, yeah, there's a double slide. So, how would we like address the issues we discussed a bit earlier? The synchronized release cycle is like probably the hardest one because it affects how both the distributions and the various platforms function currently, and it's probably not gonna be solved. We could start discussions about having long-term support versions of the environments, or aligning the release cycle a bit better, so some distribution is on 6 months and another is on a yearly cycle or whatever. Downstream UX changes are a bit weird because the desktop environments are designed properly. They have their own design team and they do testing. And when you as a downstream distributor start making decisions for them, you ignore all the research they might have done and the user testing and start invalidating their design process, which can lead to all these confusing issues. So if you are this downstream distributor and you want to do the UX changes, the best path to that is like start the discussion upstream first, and then we see how we can, can your problem be addressed. So for branding, which is another reason why distributors change things underneath the desktop developers and then the application developers, currently there's like no way to do it, and everybody's poking around private CSS variables, and which ends up causing a whole class of issues. Imagine like taking the CSS from one web page and expecting it to work on another, because it's the same thing with theming currently in JDK. And it's not just that you can have intrusive distribution branding, like big watermark logos that overlay over something, or things that are always in the spotlight because you want the people to know that you're using this particular distribution, but that really can mess with the experience that the desktop that the developer is trying to provide. So yeah, we need better branding APIs, and like this needs to be discussed upstream first also, and find a common way to work towards something like that. For the fragmentation issues, they're a bit weird. For the OS installer, there's like probably no way you can share the backend for the install, but at least you can have a common design, so not everything feels out of place and confusing if you haven't changed the distribution you're using. For the packages issues, we have Flatpak now and other containerized formats which essentially may get the application developers in control of the packaging, and that completely can bypass most of the issues. And if we start like switching from the each distro's package manager to their containerized application formats we are using to ship applications now, we can like ignore a whole class of issues that arise in GNOME software due to package kit and trying to abstract out over the whole world. For the configuration issues, it's understandable that you might want to have a certain behavior in the distribution, but most of the time you are trying to address a problem, and if you're like having any issues, if you have identified issues with a certain setting, like the touchpad settings or alt-tab behavior, it's much better to start to bring that problem upstream and also start a discussion there, because it's probably not just your users that are affected by this. For the default apps, at least GNOME has this notion of default core set of apps that we encourage downstream distributors to ship. That isn't happening today, and it's understandable because distributors want a certain set of packages, but we'd like to know why some things, some distributions might choose to ship Evolution over Geary or whatever other example of application, and how we could improve this, how we could get the distributors more aligned with how we expect the environment to be. And the Plymouth, the boot experience is a good example here also, because Plymouth in the latest version that will be released soonish received a new update where it includes branding APIs essentially. Distributors can put their logo in a non-intrusive way that does not affect the experience of booting up, and you still can recognize this is Plymouth, this is this desktop environment, this platform. And so, in short, upstream all the things. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, we have like 1 minute. So super quick summary. Essentially, what we'd like to convince you of is that Linux, Linux is really not the thing we should be talking about. We should be talking about actual platforms, because that's what we need to get these apps, right? If you want a great sort of ecosystem of third-party apps, you need to first get those platforms in order. And in order to do that, we'll need to figure out a way, whether that's like sort of dedicated platform OSs, or it's everyone working together more. But that's the thing I think we should be focusing on. And yeah, let's make things happen. If you have ideas to that, effect, like let's talk later, or we're still going to be here for a few days. And I don't think these issues are going to go away anytime soon, but we should at least work towards starting to mitigate them and improving things a little bit. Thank you.